Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're calling from, whatever you're joining us from. Welcome to this joint program with ACET, the Africa Center for Economic Transformation, and the Center for Global Development. This is about Africa taking charge, domestic resource mobilization as Africa attempts to address the post-COVID economic and social issues. We're very happy that you're joining us today. We have a wonderful, wonderful panel for you, and hopefully it can be a very productive conversation. Before I turn over to my co-facilitator, I just wanted to do some housekeeping. One is you can follow us online, on Twitter, on YouTube. And if you have questions, you can send your questions to events@cgdev.org, or you can tweet at us at cgdev or hashtag CGDtalks, or you can just send in your question on YouTube. When this crisis started, American officials began talking about the vaccine. And the way they talked about the vaccine was, we're going to treat the vaccine like we treat oxygen mask on the plane. You put on your mask before you help people. And it shows that for poor countries, it is important that they're able to finance their own health needs. And with that, I think it demonstrates why a conversation like this is important. With that, I would turn over to my co-facilitator, Ed Brown, who will introduce our distinguished panelists.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this webinar. As Julie just said, my name is Edward Brown. I'm the Senior Director at the African Center for Economic Transformation, which is based in Accra with a branch in Washington. We would like to welcome you all to this webinar. And as my colleague Judy just said, this is Africa taking charge of its future. That's the topic for this event today. And I would like to, first of all, put on just one small slide, just to show what the challenges African countries are facing with regards to domestic resource mobilization. Yeah. This is just a slide from a research team called the Curtis Research 2015-2017 that shows revenue losses in selected African countries and then the sub-Saharan African average. And the point I wanted to make here is for you to look at the percentage of revenue loss to GDP and what the implications are for some of the key social and economic programs that governments are undertaking. For Malawi, it's nearly twice the combined education and health budget. For Mozambique, the same thing. For Tanzania, combined, health and education budget, more than that. So real losses are a major, major aspect of domestic resource mobilization. And the issue here is, how do we minimize this in order, even without major fiscal reforms, that how do we really crank up revenues from domestic revenues? So I would like, first of all, to introduce our speakers. As I said earlier, as Jude said earlier, we have a very powerful group of individuals with strong backgrounds in this area who are going to enlighten us and give us their views on this issue. And the first presenter that I would like to call is Chiara Bronchi, and Karen Oze, both from the World Bank. They're going to set the stage. Chiara is the practice manager for the fiscal policy unit in the World Bank. And Saren Oza is also a senior governance specialist, also at the World Bank. They will make a quick presentation. They have about 8 to 10 minutes, and we have 6 speakers. So Chiara and Saren are just going to take about 10 minutes to do the presentation. So I'll hand over to Chiara at the moment, and let's listen to what they have to tell us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed, for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our participants. Allow me a second to say thank you to the Africa Center for Economic Transformation and the Center for Global Development, which are organizing this very interesting and timely event. And also thank you for inviting us. And I'm delighted today to represent the World Bank together with my colleague, Sharon Ozer. So today our presentation, I think, will be the only one with slides, is a bit to set the stage and give you a bit of a sense of the trends pre and post COVID and afterwards, in terms of revenues, of course, in the region. And mind you, we are focusing on sub-Saharan region, at least we are using the division that the World Bank uses. So forgive us if we are not including everyone in the continent. And I will also give you at the end, Jaren, a little bit of an overview what the World Bank is doing, both in terms of partnership and also opportunities, in particular now to support countries in their revenue efforts in this period of crisis and also in the recovery. Next slide, please. So Africa has the youngest and fastest growing population and lowest level of human capital assets. And this is, you know, as a result that we found in the World Development Report of 2019. And it is clear, it has always been clear, also as part of the Addis Ababa Agreement, that also for the Africa region to take charge of its future, building adequate human capital is more critical than anywhere else, perhaps, in the world. But this said, I think we believe that the region has made fantastic efforts, at least up to 2015, and a little bit beyond in terms of making, strengthening their ability to raise domestic revenues. And a number of countries were able to reach at least the 15% tax GDP ratio, which is a bit of the notional threshold needed for countries to deliver critical infrastructure and services. And in 2015, the region was able to make a stride. However, progress was slowed down afterwards. And if you look at the chart, there was not much progress in tax GDP ratio increases, and the trend remained pretty flat. And what is worse is that data suggests that the region average tax to GDP ratio was decreasing already before the COVID-19 crisis hit, globally. So the region remains the second highest in terms of the inability to reach 15% tax GDP ratios, and this just behind the Middle East and North Africa region, which is definitely known for its resilience on other sources of revenues. So, of course, the reasons for the weak revenue collections are multifaceted. We don't have time to go into it, but clearly it's political and also probably weakness in terms of administration and challenges in administering the tax. Normally, low tax collection is correlated with low tax effort, and the way we define low tax efforts is an index of the ratio between the share of the actual collection in percentage of gross domestic product and the taxable capacity. And taxable capacity is predicted in terms of tax to GDP ratio. So even in pre-COVID-19, many of the countries were facing challenges in raising revenues. Next slide, slide 3, please. So, and if you look it down, just to give you a sense, this chart is breaking it down by type of taxes. You see that there is a bit of a flattening towards the end, toward the right of the chart. And really, where we saw an increase in revenues was in particularly on VAT, which is a bit the workhorse of the tax. It's a main tax handle for many developing countries. But as you know, VAT is also pretty procyclical, so it follows the GDP trends, and so it may be constant by GDP, but you don't have, if you have a period of crisis, the tax would decline, and therefore very difficult to maintain, to increase the revenue collection. Slide 4. So on average, now in the COVID crisis, what we have observed that to make the situation even more challenging is that while revenues were not really performing and they're not performing well, and by the way, for countries that have adhered to the debt suspension initiative that we've been following very closely together with the IMF, we see actually there has been a decline in revenue connection, and in partly for the economic effect of the negative economic effect of the crisis. So Now, we were also trying to look at what is the situation for countries in terms of spending and how did they use the stimulus and can they afford it? And in this chart, you can see that on average, we have that the fiscal stimulus was adopted by most of the countries in the region, and it ranged around 3.5% of GDP, with 7 countries spending more than 5% of GDP. What is interesting is that in most regions, there is a correlation between the performance of the economy and the size of the stimulus. But here we can see that actually in sub-Saharan Africa, a number of countries have gone well and above and beyond what they could afford. So we see also that countries in the recovery phase not only are under pressure to sort of keep the revenues stable, but also that they will be faced with larger fiscal deficits and increasingly also higher debts. So again, even more so, one has to look very thoroughly into revenue collection and how to strengthen domestic revenue mobilization. Next, slide 5, please. The latest macro poverty outlook projects a dip in tax revenue that will take regional average tax collection between well below 15%. And then you can see also that the expectations that will be really, really hard to maintain to maintain the level of spending under control. This is just an illustration. I won't go because you're familiar with the situation that is sitting globally, but also in the region. So slide 6. Now, what can we do? And as I was saying, indirect taxation continues to account for the largest share of revenue in most of the countries in the region, remains the key tax handle, and it is important to maintain this tax solid. Why I'm using this VAT. Every country is now looking at in the stimulus. A lot of countries have actually used the tax system in terms of giving breaks, giving deferrals, reducing tax rates. And obviously, a lot of countries we found globally, not just in the region, have also attempted to reduce VAT rates and to narrow the base by allowing tax breaks. Now, in our recommendations that we also published in April on, what are the best fiscal policy mix at this point to survive a crisis and at the same time to prepare for the recovery, was to be very careful to not cut tax rates, because it's very difficult to bring them back. And basically just to give deferrals in payments, but do not give exemptions or other ways to narrow the tax base, which are extremely complicated to administer, but also very difficult to, to basically repeal them once we are back into a recovery phase. But as you can see, a lot of countries are now facing a big VAT gap, and also they have basically deliberately added loopholes through the tax policy decisions. And so this chart is basically saying, look, be careful, because the tax gap, and I'm taking just one important tax, it's really large. And the tax gap is increasing, and basically there are lost opportunities in the future. Now let's move on to slide 7. So how can we close the ineffective loopholes? And so one of the recommendations was, okay, let's analyze the policy gaps, and that are mostly also tax expenditure. As I explained, tax lowered rates, tax holidays, and tax incentives, and often they introduce non-tax purposes. So one of the things that it was important to analyze it is now, not just in the past, but now even more than before, is to really assess whether all those tax breaks, let's call them that way, or tax holidays, were really to support an economy that is struggling, or whether it is supporting some special groups, but not necessarily, not necessarily going in favor of the entire community. Next slide, please. Slide 8. Inequality will increase due to COVID-19, and policymakers will need to ensure that those who fared worse during the pandemic benefit from the recovery measures. So basically protect the most vulnerable part of the population and the economy. And the tax system clearly has a role. And we are looking at the tax system from 3 dimensions. One is definitely inclusion, the other one is innovation, and the third one, and I will go quickly over these 3 points, on sustainability and how to support the economy to recover in a sustainable way. So what is the role in inclusion? Well, as I was saying, tax expenditure are a big Achilles heel. And in particular, because they're not necessarily supporting the interests of everyone, they tend to address interests of lobbies and particular groups. And they basically deter from the possibility of using to have more spending available. And so we have, as ARIS and others in 2018, calculated that ending VAT expenditure and implementing a universal basic income tax would improve the post-tax Gini coefficient potentially quite dramatically, actually, and improving both revenue and equity outcomes. So one big recommendation is this is the time to really assess the tax system, and in particular the base, and to really have a framework on whether this spending are worth it or not. Next, please. So while, next slide, please. So while tax innovation is essential, tax equity is important, we also are focusing on innovation. So on the tax policy side, is nothing new under the sun, to be honest. It's much more, let's be firm and let's not give in into, so basically, let's assess whether the tax breaks are really worth it. On the innovation side, the way forward will call for greater modernization of tax administrations. And all tax administrations have been faced challenges in business continuity. And frankly, we know for a fact that countries that had, or tax administration that had already introduced innovation and adopted new technological means to improve compliance, auditing, and also facilitation to payments have scored better than those that have postponed this type of reforms. Innovation has many dimensions, and certainly the help of technology is extremely important. And I want to give you an example that is close to us, and it's in response to COVID-19, the Kenya Revenue Authority, with the support of the Prospect Collaborative, which is an initiative led by Ernst & Young and the World Bank and MIT, has implemented reforms that had a positive impact on companies, ensuring that officials could work remotely from their homes during lockdown by quickly updating the software on their laptops, and also shifting from on-site to off-site audits. As you can see from their website, the KRA offers several now online services on an easy to navigate web page. They could do that, of course, because they've been able already to do reforms over the years. And this COVID-19 has opened the opportunity to accelerate some of these reforms.
Yara,
yeah.
I mean, if you can try to wrap up, and because you're a little bit over time.
Yes, we have only 4 more slides, so I will move on. I just wanted to give an example, and then the last one on sustainability, slide 10. Now, what is another area of opportunities for revenue mobilization? It's to look at a number of taxes that are not necessarily only focused on revenue mobilization and equity, but is also addressing some negative externalities. And so one is important is carbon taxation, and we're working very closely with the IMF on these items. There are countries that are, through subsidies on brown economies and brown energy, they're losing a lot of revenues. So having a focus on green taxation would mean, a double dividend in a way, revenue increase, and also having a positive income on the sustainability of the economy. We also have, and we are looking at sin taxes and also a revision of some taxes that can enable everyone to participate. So assessing the tax system also from a perspective of gender balance, equity, and participation, and trying to limit the inefficiency in the system. I will move on to slide 11. And then I will pass over to Jaren. So the World Bank is active in Sub-Saharan Africa with 97 projects. We have a portfolio of 950 million allocated to tax projects. And we have revised now, we help countries to revise the use of these resources to respond more forcefully to the COVID-19 crisis and the shortages in revenue. Part of the focus is definitely on emphasizing the digitalization of services and also encouraging development partners to utilize more efficient and fiscal sustainable system. And basically the focus remains a lot on efficiency and equity, and to keep on broadening the base and resisting basically from taking tax policy decisions that are extremely difficult to reverse. Now I leave it here and I will take questions later, and just pass the floor to Jerem very quickly. Jerem, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chiara.
Sarah?
And can I just take a minute? It'll be very quick. Thank you. Apologize for that. As Chiara said, World Bank is very active on supporting tax efforts of countries, member countries. And one of the main vehicles we use for tax-related support is the Global Tax Program managed out of our unit. I just want to say that this supports about $72 million of technical assistance work. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see a map of countries in the continent that this trust-funded program is funding projects and activities. And I really want to emphasize that our work supports mainly IDA countries. 70% of the portfolio is supporting IDA countries. And out of that, actually, 40% of the overall portfolio goes to fragile, conflict and violence affected countries. So we're hoping to really fill that gap where the needs are the largest. We try to be of best support to the countries. Also, there is a strategic sort of focus, in addition to bread and butter tax policy and administration work, we're focusing on the role of tax in terms of behavior change. So health taxes, so taxes on tobacco, sugar sweetened beverages, alcohol, as well as greening of tax systems is a main focus. Also gender equity and taxation. And our colleagues are also working on how to increase voluntary compliance and the trust issues in the tax system. And the right-hand slide really shows that there's a lot of opportunity with excise taxes in the continent. Perhaps this is something we can discuss during the open discussion. So therefore, also could be an effective tool during the COVID-19 to increase revenue intake, while also improving health outcomes, for example.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, and then this is the very last thing. I want to tell you about the Platform for Collaboration on Tax, which is a collaboration of 4 partners active on tax matters: IMF, OECD, United Nations, and the World Bank. During the open discussion through the chat function, I'll share the website. Just want to say that we have an excellent series of international taxation related webinars, as well as a webinar coming up on the medium-term revenue strategies for Africa in collaboration with ATAF. So please check out the resources there. I'll share them to the chat function. Thanks again, and apologies for running over time.
Thank you so much, Kiara and Sharon. I think this has been quite informative, although you've taken twice the amount of time that has been allotted to you. I'm going to call on Sufyan Ahmed Becker, who is currently the non-resident fellow at CDG, and he was the former advisor. He was the former Minister of Finance of Ethiopia.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the Center for Global Development and African Center for Economic Transformation to organize these meetings regarding the resource mobilization, domestic resource mobilization in Africa. Well before the COVID, the situation in Africa regarding domestic resource mobilization was not really that much improving, even before the COVID. As you know, for the last 20 years, economies in Africa were expanding significantly. Poverty was declining significantly. Somehow, most of African countries really invest in health, education, and the basic services. But when we look at the financing aspects, most of sub-Saharan African tax GDP ratio was really stagnated around 15%. Then in Addis in 2015, regarding financing of sustainable development, we have this agreement that, yes, we need to some extent external assistance to financing the sustainable goals, mainly through ODA, external loans, private sectors. But we emphasized at the same time, the major source of financing for development in Africa should come from domestic resources. Now with the COVID, the economy is in decline. All the gains Africa made over the last 20 years is really eroding. For the first time, poverty is rising, and millions of students in Africa are out of schools. At the same time, the finance need to tackle the COVID is really huge, as we understand. So again, we came back to the same questions. If really Africa should take its future in its hands, we must focus on our own resource mobilization domestically. From my experience in Ethiopia, and as I've seen many African countries, there are really 4 big holes that we should fill if we need to make any significant progress. The number one is tax exemption that people from the World Bank and you yourself really precisely presented to us earlier. It is huge, as you said, and different studies showed that close to 40 to 50% of tax collected are also lost in exemptions. This over around 5–6% of GDP. The rationales usually is, well, this is to invite investors, to incentivize them that they can come and invest in our countries. And as a result, there is a competition among ourselves, African countries, really, to be more generous to attract investment. And I absolutely agree with the expert from the World Bank that the main reason the really investors come to a region, to a country, is really, it's not for tax incentives. It has to do with, first of all, predictable policies, availabilities of really skilled labor, the effectiveness of the government, and then the others. But we compete among ourselves, and we are losing huge amount of resources. The other rationale that is given for exemption is, well, maybe to help the poor. We do this in Ethiopia and many African countries, that we exempt in the name of equity, in the name of protecting the poor. But really, all the studies show that this, I don't think that there should be other ways of really targeting, helping the needy instead of giving the overall exemptions. Therefore, this tax evasion, tax exemptions is a huge, unless the government are serious. It's mainly because of it's political commitment. It's not technical issues. It is easy to implement. Sometimes you call it a political commitment, but rather it is a proactive hindrance by politicians, really, even to do anything with this tax exemption. So one big hole is tax exemption. Second is tax evasion. Tax evasion mainly by big corporations. They have the capacities, the technical know-hows. Their auditors in big corporations are more powerful than the tax auditors in our tax administrations. They cannot. Most of our tax administrations, we lack the capacity even to audit these big corporations. So we have to do something about the tax evasion, mainly of the big corporations. The third big hole I see is regarding the property taxes. Whether it is land, whether it is real estate, I think in most African countries, the property tax is really insignificant. But we know this sector is booming. And as I know, in other developed countries, one of the main sustainable source of tax is property tax. And this is the third hole. Finally, the fourth big hole is the non-tax revenue. In most African countries, this is rents on natural resources, whether they are minerals, whether they are other resources. I don't think we are getting the fair share of our natural resources. Again, this is related to political commitment and also to some extent to our capacity limitations. So these are the big four holes that really I want to emphasize on. Finally, the usual two broad categories of challenge regarding reforming our tax system. The first one is, as I've said, is the lack of political commitments to do anything regarding all these four holes. The second category of challenge is the capacity limitation at our tax administrations. These are mainly technical. I'm sure that the World Bank and the IMF over the years were helping our tax administration to increase their capacities. The first thing that we need our tax administration level is really the capacity to collect, generate, analyze informations regarding taxpayers. In most of cases, even we don't know who is paying tax and who is not paying tax. So the first thing is really to have this capacity using the technologies to collect the data, to analyze the data, and to assess. Finally, again, at the technical capacity limitation, our tax administration is the capacity limitation for enforcement. Yes, in every country, taxpayers should pay voluntarily, but that is not enough. There should be a law, and most importantly, the law should be implemented consistently across. In most countries, we cannot, they don't have the capacity to enforce those laws unless we overcome those two challenges, political commitment and capacity limitations. We cannot move ahead. Of those two challenges, political commitment is the most critical one, in my opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Sufyan. I think, to call on the next speaker, part of the challenge would be for us to try and focus on what actions should governments be doing. Mr. Sufyan has given us a good list of the kinds of challenges that governments are facing. Mr. Dabo, who is the Commissioner General for the Gambia Revenue Authority, I hope you can give us some of the innovative things that you're taking in light of the COVID, the pressures on the fiscal regime, and the whole issue of debt. If you can speak a little bit to what the Revenue Authority is doing, the innovative actions that you're undertaking in Gambia to help crank up domestic revenue. Over to you, Mr. Dabo.
Thank you very much, moderator. I want to say hello to my other colleagues that are part of the panel and those that are following us too. As you said, my name is Yankuba Dabo. I am the Commissioner General, Gambia Revenue Authority. And we have a very interesting discussions today, and looking at Africa's situation is very sad. We have a lot that we can, where we can generate revenue in our various countries, but we are not being able to do this due to a couple of challenges that if we really are serious and follow, we might be able to generate a lot of revenue for our countries. And in recent times, discussions on domestic revenue mobilization has been gaining momentum. The importance of these topics cannot be overemphasized, particularly for developing economics, because of the development needs and the growing donor fatigue as other global challenges such as climate change, international terrorism, health pandemic, among others, took precedence. In the Gambia, we believe domestic revenue mobilization can be enhanced if, for example, the following challenges are addressed and certain reforms are effectively implemented. If I can start, some of the key challenges that we are facing in the domestic revenue mobilization, which might be a similar ones in other developing countries. One is the high tax expenditure. As at end of the 2020, the tax expenditure in the Gambia was estimated at 3.1% of the GDP. We have a lot of investors that come to this country, and once they arrive, the first things that they look at is what other opportunities in terms of incentives am I going to be getting from the government. We have a region called SIC, that's a Special Investment Certificate. And in most cases, if investors come over, when you have a business plan that is slightly over $250,000, you are likely to be qualified to have an investment certificate that will grant you for almost a 5-year period, you will not pay most of the taxes. And this, as tax collectors, we have seen this to be really a serious area that needs to be looked at, because a lot of revenues are going away out of nothing. In addition to that, we have what we call duty waivers, which are normally dealt with also related to the tax exemption. And a lot of revenues are also gone through the duty waivers, which we also need to be looked at. So in general, higher tax expenditure is an issue. And I think this is a problem for all African countries, as the previous speaker has also mentioned something close to that. So I think if we collectively, administratively, if we look at those situations, we look at how the tax expenditures are monitored, and it can save us a lot of money for our country's needs. Secondly, the other area of concern I have, which is a big challenge in most African countries, is inadequate enforcement of the withholding tax regime. As we know, most projects and some government agencies are not withholding taxes as required by the law. Instead, they hide behind the wrong assumption that donor funds cannot be taxed, when actually these payments being made to these suppliers or contracts are in respect of goods or services provided. A lot of projects are going, a lot of contracts are going, and the law has stated, if you generate a revenue in the country, even though if the work is done outside of the country, in the Gambia, there is a percentage of 15% of that total contract sum, gross, should be collected and remitted to the revenue authority as withholding tax. But we have realized that a lot of other contracts are signed, and these are in millions. They go to big companies outside of the country without necessarily the 15% being collected. So this, we think that is a challenge, and we are working on it, closely with the relevant authorities to make sure that we go by the law, what the law states, so that the revenue that is going away, we can capture it. Equally, some of the companies that are within the country and ministries, departments, agencies, they sign a lot of contracts with other contractors, big and small, and the law indicated that 10% of those contracts should be held as withholding tax. And we've realized that this is not the case in many countries, in many companies. So we are calling meetings, trying to reach to those institutions that are not really playing by the law, to make sure that they do what is expected of them. And we feel that this, if we can get them on board, we could get a lot of revenue on our side. And I know that this is a similar thing that is happening in most developing countries. They are not respecting the withholding taxes, which has been specified in most of our country's laws. In addition, inadequacy of technical capacity in the audit for specialized areas like the telecoms, the big telecom companies, auditing them is a problem. And the extractive industries, tourism and hospitality, and pay TVs. These are areas that are owned by, these companies are owned by big companies, big companies that are get their main bodies outside of our country. And we know that auditing them is a problem. To have the technical capacity and the equipment to audit them is always a challenge in the tax authorities. And we have realized through the help of IMF recently that they're giving us some capacity building. We've realized that a lot of money we can realize a lot of money from these companies if only we have the adequate training and the capacity building to be able to man them, because these are giant companies. These are big companies. They have the structure, they have the technical capabilities to do what they are doing, and maybe the revenue authorities need to work on that. We need to do a lot of capacity building. We need a lot of technical support from our development partners. If they want us to live and challenge these multinational companies to a point where we can unveil a lot of things that are happening. So I think this is an area that's also a big challenge, and collectively, if we work together with our development partners, we may be able to achieve something on these things. And then going furthermore with international trade, we have realized that proper documentation is lacking. And most of these big companies, when they're dealing with us, we find it difficult to get a proper documentation from them. And things, and this could really help us if where we have the opportunity to have their proper papers, they submit it, and we just have to apply the percentages. And that could be very helpful for revenue authorities. And in addition, in complete automation of revenue administration processes. In most African countries, we are trying to use the IT systems to do the revenue collection. And with that automation, there is a lot that is lacking. For example, I'll take an example in the Gambia. With our domestic revenue mobilization, we are using a system called GamTaxNet. For the last 10 years, we're using this system, technology, but it's still inadequate. There's a lot to improve. There's a lot to be desired. There's a lot we can get out of the system. We keep on upgrading, but we haven't got the best out of it. And through our negotiation with World Bank, they've realized that really what our complaint is, the system is inadequate. And if the system is proper, we could get a lot of revenue. And World Bank now has come to our aid. They want to help us to change the system to another one called the iTax. So we are in the process of, with the World Bank, to change that. And we hope that if that system comes in and our automation in that area is functional properly, we could get a lot of revenue. And also, we could get the correct data, the information, because once we have the automation proper, then the data, availability of the data is easy. And then it will help us to monitor the taxpayers properly as compared to the current system we have. Equally, in respect to automation, we have a system in the Gambia that we are using, ACET Plus for international trade. This, we know that this system, there is a lot of shortcomings. And I know a lot of other African countries are using ACET Plus. But recently, we are trying to move to ACET World, which is a web-based. We know it has more capacity, more capabilities than the current system we are using. These are areas that we need to improve on. And through the support of our development partners, African Development Bank, they are also coming up to help us to change that system from ACET Plus to ACET World. And we believe that having the ACET World, it will help us a lot in terms of our automation. And the other point I want to refer here as a challenge is the large informal sector with little contribution to the tax. We know the way the African setup is, we have a lot of businesses, but the majority are in the informal sector. And to capture this, to bring this informal sector into the tax bracket is a nightmare. So it's an area that we really trying to work hard, and it's a big challenge for us. And finally, with the challenges, we inadequate capacity to tax business operating on e-commerce platform. As I was saying previously, our system in terms of IT in most African countries, we have a problem. And now, the challenge is, the biggest challenge is, how do we tax businesses that are on e-commerce? That's a $1 million question that we are really looking forward. And it's a big challenge. I know this challenge is not only facing Gambia, but it's facing many other African countries. So to address these challenges, and we are thinking that it needs a lot of commitment. There has to be a need of strong political commitment to review an existing revenue laws and investment codes with a view of eliminating and rationalizing the generous incentive packages built into them. The administration of the incentive regimes, which I explained earlier on, also need to be improved significantly in order to remove the operational loopholes. And in other words, what I'm trying to say here is we need the political will, because most of these incentives are given through some political connections. The political will has to be there to make sure that we do the right thing. those who deserve to have this incentive, they have. Those who don't deserve, they come and pay the taxes. So we think that if we have the good political will, and in different African countries, our revenue base will increase. So we will not be going in for a lot of time for aids, grants, and things like that. And in addition, yeah, if I can just complete this quickly. In addition to strengthen the technical audit and the enforcement capacity, I mentioned earlier, we all know that in most countries, the domestic tax revenue collection is self-assessment. So you must have a very strong tax audit system in your countries. If you have a very strong tax for people with higher professional qualification, and they can challenge these big companies and they will unveil a lot. But without that, then there'll be a problem. Thirdly, we have to expand and enforce the collection of withholding taxes by both ministries, department, agencies, and projects. And we have to strengthen the capacities in customs valuation by making sure that proper documentations are put in place. And also to complete the automation of both domestic and international trade, which I mentioned earlier. We need to put the IT system in place to make sure that we leverage on ICT, and then it can help us a lot. And then finally, the domestic laws to be effectively taxed, the current e-commerce business activities. We need to do some legislations to make sure that they are put in place so that those doing the e-commerce, they will be brought into the bracket, and their taxes, they will pay their rightful taxes. And I think these are some of the things. I may not take too much of the time, but these are some of the suggestions I am putting forward. If we can do around this, I am sure we will be able to mop out a lot of revenue for our countries that is needed for our development. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dabo. I think you have listed quite a list of key areas, very specific on the issues that you think needs to be done and what you're trying to do and the challenges that you're facing with withholding taxes. You talked about the issue of capacity, and also the whole area of digitalization and the capacity to be able to tax.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
This is a very useful segue into the next speaker, Mr. Matthew Harrison, who is the head of the Middle East and Asia and Pacific for Vodafone. He will be also making some observations regarding the challenges, in terms of taxation, how government and the private sector can really engage in order to effectively build a good fiscal base for development. So, Mr. Harrison, over to you, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in today's session. I represent the Vodafone Group. We are mobile communications, telecommunications operator. In Africa, we operate in 8 countries under the Vodafone Group. That includes Vodacom Group, which is headquartered in South Africa and operates in Lesotho, DRC, Mozambique, and Tanzania. It includes Safaricom in Kenya, and Vodafone in Ghana, and Vodafone in Egypt. We also have we operate M-Pesa, mobile financial services, across Africa as well. I think before I come on to tax, I think it's important to respond to the earlier question around the health and economy crisis brought out by COVID. This obviously is affecting all of us and all the people who are in the countries or on the continent. And Vodafone, early on in the crisis, back in March time, launched its 6-point plan for Africa to support and help the governments and the people in the countries where we operate. That 6-point plan was really firstly focusing on the infrastructure, so both the telecommunications and the financial services infrastructure that we provide in the countries. In the first part of the crisis, network traffic for our services increased by over 60% in most of our countries. So our first priority was to ensure that everyone now working from home, studying at home, were able to connect to those services. The second point of our plan is focusing and continues to focusing to help the governments with the response to the health crisis through public information, telecentres, and increasingly e-health as well. And then also education, so digital education, digital platforms. We have over 3 million of our customers using online digital platforms currently in our markets, and we wish to continue to support governments and citizens with education. The third area particularly is around supporting people who are most vulnerable in our countries. And there's a number of ways we're doing that, including affordability of our services. So, for example, our company in South Africa launched a product called Connect You in April. And since then, there's over 10 million people in South Africa using the Connect You product to for data and accessing the mobile internet for key services. Then digitalizing SMEs and businesses, so really focusing on supporting businesses during the crisis, but especially in the recovery of building back better. So having SMEs using increasing digital tools, similar to the discussion on this call around tax authorities having access and utilizing digital tools. That's what we want to support businesses, ranging from bigger businesses to smaller figure, self-employed. Agriculture is a key area where we're focusing on as well. The fifth point is actually using our data services and aggregated data to support the COVID response, to understand movements of people, etc., which is helping governments with that response. And then last but not least is mobile financial services and ensuring that people are able to use cashless services during the pandemic. And there's a lot we're doing with our mobile financial services, especially in Kenya, but also in our other markets. So these are a 6-point plan, which is really focusing on helping, but also digital transformation in the countries that we operate. Our main sort of message to everyone listening is, in order for us to and everyone to be able to access digital services, there's a lot for us to do. If you look at the UN Broadband Commission study a couple of years ago, I think they calculated that in order to connect the unconnected people in Africa to mobile internet and internet services, it's going to cost over $109 billion to do that. We as mobile operators, telecoms operators, continue to invest. But in order to close that gap, partnerships are critical. So partnerships with the World Bank, that's an entity that we talk to a lot. Partnerships with governments, partnerships with the people listening on this session. It is critical, and one of the things I would like to highlight related partnerships, there's some really good roadmaps for digital transformation that international community, the African community have developed. So the African Union Commission have developed a digital transformation strategy, which we think is very sensible. So has the UN Secretary General. They have a digital cooperation roadmap, which a number of the entities participating today are members of. And again, we believe that's very successful. And really what we want to focus on now is working together to execute and deliver on these roadmaps. A key part of it will be taxation policy. I think there's a lot of studies out there which show the impact of taxation on services like digital services. And one of the things I would ask colleagues on the panel to do is, as when you're having your very important discussions around taxation reform, and I really enjoyed the presentation so far, and the approach outlined by the World Bank earlier around inclusion, innovation, sustainability. Please include digital transformation as part of your deliberations, because the tax regime in the countries will play a very important role in digital transformation. And at the same time, digital, as highlighted by my colleague from Gambia, can have an important role in improving the efficiency of tax regimes as well. So maybe I'll stop there given time, but really my main ask is that and call out is for us to all work together to support digital transformation to help us to build back better.
Thank you so much, Mr. Harrison. I think this has been quite enlightening. You did mention the importance of partnership. Mr. Dabo mentioned the challenges governments are facing regarding capacity to even understand what are the underlying dynamics with these innovations that are coming up. So the issue of capacity and the interface between the private sector, particularly the telecoms and the government, in trying to fill this gap and have a true partnership that would lead to a better and efficient services and also revenue. More importantly, the whole issue of the digital infrastructure and the cost of it and how governments and the private sector need to interact. That brings us to
Ed, just one second. I wanted to remind the audience that if you have questions, please send your questions to events@cgdev.org. Send your questions to us on YouTube, send your questions to us on Twitter. And just a quick reminder for the audience. Sorry, Ed, go for it.
No, that's fine, yeah. So we now go to Madam Helen Yehat, who is the project manager for Agence Française de Développement. Is with the finance management unit of AFD to give us a few observations regarding where we're facing now, particularly if you can talk a little bit more about how governments and the support that AFD is providing to governments in this COVID era, where there's serious pressure, fiscal pressures on expenditures.
Good afternoon. I will share my screen. I have some slides. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me to this panel. I would like to share some thoughts we have at AFD, the French Development Agency, on the question which is asked today. So there are two major additional challenges for domestic revenue mobilization nowadays, as already the other panelists said. The first one is the COVID pandemic, which calls for increased spending needs to face the consequences of the crisis. At the same time, we see that the crisis has particularly severe effects on the most vulnerable people, which might imply a rise in inequality within countries. So these two facts calls for a need for more tax revenue mobilization, but with a particular attention to the tax incidence. So one way is to expand the tax base, but to make sure that the wealthier contribute proportionally more to tax revenue mobilization. The second challenge is related to the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And it will imply forthcoming reduction in tariffs, and so a loss of revenue from trade taxes, which still contribute quite a lot in the revenue for several African countries. But I wanted to emphasize that this loss of revenue is not a new challenge, since there were already several waves of trade liberalization, and tax administration are already doing large efforts to recover the trade tax revenue losses from domestic tax revenues. And these efforts are already underway in all the African countries. I would like to present what we are doing at AFD, at the French Development Agency, to support the countries in their effort of tax revenue mobilization. So we have ongoing projects in several countries, namely in Niger, Mali, Guinea, and Comoros. And we are funding activities of capacity building in human resources, but also in material resources. And we are providing technical assistance, both for tax, customs administration, but also for the treasury. These activities of capacity building, they are for enhancing basic key function of day-to-day work of the staff in the tax administration, but they are also at developing more innovative ways of working and to increase the efficiency of this administration. And I will say a word on that in the next slide. The second point I want to make is related to what I said previously about the equitable tax system. And it's that at AFD, we have developed a partnership with the Commitment to Equity Institute, which has developed a methodology to assess the fiscal incidence of an existing tax system. So we have worked with several Ministry of Finance in Africa to do a diagnosis of who is paying taxes and what is the incidence of the fiscal system. And it also enables to draw reforms and to identify a way of modifying the tax system to make it more equitable. I will now turn to my last slide to speak about one clear opportunity that seems to emerge in the context of the COVID pandemic. And it's, as we have seen all, the COVID is accelerating the technology revolution with a lot of digital solutions emerging in a variety of areas, health, education, environment. So my question is, what are the digital solutions that could be developed to overcome tax administration difficulties in Africa? And I just wanted to share with you some of a few examples that we are aware of and that could be used and replicated. So the three examples are, the first one is the use of pay by phone solution for the road tax in Guinea. The implementation of this solution has permitted to multiply by more than 3 the revenue compared to the previous year where there was no such solution. The next innovation I wanted to speak about is the use of satellite imagery for a better knowledge of the tax base. So as you know, satellite imagery are now available for free online, and the software to handle all this data are also free. So it provides a huge area of implementation to better assess the tax base, for instance, for property taxes. The last example is comes from Niger, where in the customs administration, the staff has been trained to use data science as a tool to fight against fraud. So the use of data science allows them to better target where to do controls at the border in order to collect more VAT and the other taxes that are collected at the border. So just to conclude, the question maybe is that, so there are only 3 examples that I spoke about, but the question is how to scale up this initiative, to develop them, maybe to share the best practices, and to learn about the risk that are within this innovation, and how to mitigate the risk to make sure that tax revenue mobilization could be increased with this technology. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I think this is quite specific, and you've highlighted a number of interesting innovations that are occurring in the countries in which AFD is operating. The last but not the least is Dauda Sembine, who is the former senior economist advisor to the president of Senegal and now distinguished non-resident fellow at CDG. Dauda, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. Very good to be with all of you today. You know, the good thing with being the last to talk is actually you have the benefit of relying on what everybody has already said. So it's make your work much easier. So I think none of us can overemphasize, I guess, the need for Africa to take charge of its future, as the title of the seminar indicate, by increasing domestic revenue mobilization. I think as we are struggling with the crisis, there is a extensive need for government to help contain the human and economic cost of the impact of the crisis, which means that you need to mobilize more resources. There is also a need for African governments to support the recovery effort, which also means that you need actually more resources to allocate to that endeavor. The reality is, unfortunately, Africa has not been faring well for the past decades. I think if you refer to the presentation that our colleague from the World Bank actually did earlier, you will see that actually for the last 3 decades, since the 90s, tax to GDP ratio in Africa has actually evolved between 12 to 15%, which is quite actually you know, low, and which means also that actually over the last 3 decades, Africa were able to increase its tax to GDP ratio by only 3% of GDP. And if you compare that with the need for African countries to achieve SDGs, you realize that actually there is going to be a need for much more effort for Africa to achieve the SDGs. So if I refer to one estimation that the IMF actually did in a paper that was published a couple of years ago, was that I guess many low-income countries would need to add as much as 15% of GDP in terms of additional spending to achieve SDGs. And actually out of those 15%, almost 5% of GDP has to come from domestic sources. So actually, it sort of shows that there is a lot that needs to be done in Africa to mobilize the level of resources needed to create fiscal space for responding to the crisis, but also for achieving the SDGs. That being said, I think actually I wouldn't come back to what previous speakers have already said, which is I guess there are many ways to conduct tax reforms so that I guess they can be effective. I think some of them talks about the need for tax exemption to be reduced, others talked about actually the need to broaden the tax base, or also even to also improve gender equity in taxation. I think all of those are a good way to do it, but I would actually emphasize one common issues across all of those tax reforms, and that's actually the need to overcome vested interest. I think Mr. Sufyan talked about earlier about the 2 issues or the 2 major challenges I think actually are standing in the way of tax mobilization, revenue mobilization in Africa, and for him that's actually capacity constraint and the lack of political commitment. I would certainly agree with that, but I would think that actually I would give a bigger weight to the issue of lack of political commitment when you want to explain why, I guess, some tax reform are not being implemented. Because if you look at it, I think, whether you're trying to reduce tax exemption or you are trying to broaden the tax base, you're going to be facing actually a number of issues that are related to vested interests. They would not certainly want to be losers in tax reform, and they would do whatever they can to maintain their prerogative and their benefits. So how do you go about it? I think is what matters. How do you overcome those resistance from vested interests? I think that's the key question to ask ourselves. And my guess, of course, is, as many agree, is you need a strong political will and political commitment to address those issues and to overcome those interests. And certainly, I think we have to keep in mind that that political commitment and that strong commitment to address them should not be only left to the executive branch. Every branch of government has to play its role, whether it's the government, whether it's parliament, that needs to make sure that they actually ensure proper oversight of the tax reform and tax legislation, or whether it's the judiciary. They need also to make sure that they are actually enforcing the rule of law and enforcing tax legislation in a way that makes sure that, I guess, interest group has less leverage on making their way. I think that's certainly important. But once you have political commitment and also leadership that is strong, you need something else. And my guess is, I guess, by ensuring fiscal transparency, you can also help overcome vested interests. How so? Because if the taxpayers realize that, you know, the proceeds of tax revenues are used in a commendable way, I think that would help them and that would push them to be more willing to support those revenue mobilization efforts. That's for one. So I think fiscal transparency is extremely important. Another thing that is important also is to make sure that you build incentive for taxpayers to comply with tax reform. And there, I think having a good communication strategy is something that has proven to be quite helpful in many countries that were able to raise their revenue, domestic revenue, in a level that is adequate. And also, I think, and there I would agree with what Matt was talking earlier about, is the fact that you need also to build partnership, to develop partnership. And when you talk about those partnerships, it has to be with both domestic stakeholders and external stakeholders. If you're not able to do that, the chances are for you to advance your domestic revenue mobilization reform are going to be stalling at some point, because I guess whenever some stakeholders feel that they would be the one on the losing side of DRM reform, they might actually stand in the way of those reforms. So you have to make sure that, of course, you need to enforce the rules and tax legislation by using a corrective approach, but at the same time, you also need to incentivize the stakeholders so that they can feel what is it in it for them and why they need to support the tax reform, so that I guess you can achieve your objective. Maybe at this stage, that's where I would stop and looking forward to the discussion later on when we have the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this summarizes the 7 speakers, if you will. We're going to, I don't know whether we've had some questions that have come in yet. So I'm going to hand over to Jude. But before I do that, I would like to take the liberty, as also one of the moderators, to ask this question. I mean, you just mentioned the issue of vested interest and the issue of political will. And so the Minister, Sufyan, also mentioned this issue. The question, how do you get that? You know, because we say this all the time. I mean, what sort of evidence do we need to demonstrate the impact of, tax expenditures on the total, poverty reduction strategy that governments are trying to do, or the transformation? When we started, I showed on the slide, just one slide that looks at the revenue losses and the equivalency for financing key social programs, education and health. Twice as much, in some cases about the same. But shouldn't this be something that should be hitting the leadership, that they need to put their resources where their money is? Their mouth is, because we keep on talking about vested interest, political will, and so on. How do we broker the knowledge to really get traction on dealing with this issue?
Thank you, Ed. And as we transition to our discussion piece, I just wanted to make a couple of comments. One is that just the consistency across the presentations from the panelists is as after we agree on all of the main points. That one, that this is much less, it's as much a political problem as it is a technical problem. That opportunities like this, with the crisis that is brought upon by the pandemic, it provides us an opportunity to reassess our tax structure and see if it's actually benefiting the economy. I just wanted to add a point before I go over to the questions. And this is that, you know, having served in government for about close to a decade, when we go into elections, right, we have to buy motorcycles, we have to buy t-shirts, we have to buy rice and stuff that we give to the people who vote for us. The money to be able to finance those elections come from the private sector. When the private sector make those kinds of investment in our campaigns, they expect that when we come to power, there are things in our policies that's going to benefit them. And so in a long way, these vested interests, the way they capture the state, the way they capture the tax system, sometimes it's simply in the kind of support they provide for us when we run for office. So when we talk about the political will of being able to change the tax structure so that it's actually functional. And Ed, to your point, I mean, sometimes the information is there in terms of how much money is lost, right? But because the question is not considered in that manner. So I hope as my panelists answer these questions is to be able to talk to the motivations of the politicians who are responsible for changing the system and how we can be able to shape their motivations. The first questions we have here, and what we'll do is, as much as possible, please keep your responses brief because there's many of you, and anyone can take the question first. The first one it concerns the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. What do the panelists see as the short and long-term impact of a transcontinental trade agreement on taxes? I think a couple of people mentioned that, but I want to start with that because it is the biggest thing happening on the continent now. And now that we're talking about domestic resource mobilization, what impact do you think it will have? Please, anyone.
Maybe a few words. I think we are in. Let me get the question on this Pan-African agreement on what should be the future of taxation, and I think implicitly we were talking about international taxation, and I think as you know, there is a discussion going on. It's mostly driven by the OECD countries and initiated also by the OECD countries. And this was prompted in particular because of how to tax. What is the future of taxation in the digital economy? I think it would be great to have the African continent, maybe at the level of the African Union, to be able to formulate a proposal that also places the countries of the Africa into an equal level of discussion. It's not easy. We normally run tax models that are defined on OECD tax models for good reasons, for convenient reasons. But I think the time has come to really also for, I would say, new emerging economies to get together and to really redefine what is a fair share of taxation, of revenues that should be paid. And I think there is a lot of gain for African countries to get together. We are working with a number of countries right now also on reassessing bilateral agreements. A lot of bilateral agreements were designed at times in which, I I guess there were post-colonization period, and so very much weighed towards exporter economies based in OECD or advanced world. And I think there is a moment also to revise this on a bilateral basis. For example, we are supporting Senegal, and they have actually upgraded their bilateral agreements with key partners. So yes, we would encourage this debate. And again, it's political. Technically, there are many solutions, and I think technology is offering tremendous amount of solutions that we also heard from Hélène. The big data in particular is possible to cross data. We can, if you're interested, organize something even with the Russian Federation. They've made strides in what they've been able to do in an environment which is definitely very opaque and not particularly based on trust. But yet, through technology and automation, they've been able to make tax administration invisible, and the revenue collection has increased dramatically also because there is no manual interference. To add a question, I wish I had an answer. I don't, after spending 25 plus years in supporting and providing technical assistance. Political, how to go over the political economy, I think it's really an internal issue of the social pact and social agreement. I think the more people are educated, at least to have the basic understanding of what is the role of the government and of public finances vis-a-vis the citizens, and so moving out from a subsidiary approach, but to become citizens, that's key. And it's not advocacy here, it's really key for people to take, to install also the trust between citizens and governments, and also clearly balance what are the expectations. I think there is progress. And partly because of also access to information and knowledge. And yes, it's ups and downs, but we've seen, I'm talking about Kenya, and also I see progress even in Uganda, which is, as you know, not an easy political environment, but where there's been more access to information and data is available for free and accessible and downloadable for free. There are amazing initiatives of citizens, maybe a small group, that are able to draw information and to bring it back into the space and to mobilize a bit more the political audience.
Thank you, Shara.
I stop here.
Yes,
Thanks.
thank you. And Sufyan wanted to respond. Sufyan?
Well, thank you. Regarding the African Trade Initiative, I think it's a good initiative. It took us how many decades? I don't know, 3-4 decades. Now we reach here. My concern is regarding this initiative is not really the tax losses. For sure, there may be some tax losses in the short term, but any rate, trade between African countries is very limited, as we know. The major concern should really be the smooth movement of goods, the way the customs work together, joint customs posts, same declaration form, using the technologies. These are the critical ones. Otherwise, really, we should encourage this free trade area, which should have been implemented many years ago. In the short term, there may be some revenue losses here and there, but that's not really a major concern. Regarding the political commitments, I absolutely agree with Daud that it's at different levels, executive or parliament, even at the local government levels. But I would also want to mention donors should also really play a positive role here. In some cases, the projects funded by donors in most of our countries, every time the request we have on our table is a request from very known development agents, be donor ambassador to request to give the same treatment that I gave to the others. So there is also a competition, I think. In Addis, we agreed that, and I also understand some donors are moving in that direction. That will be really very critical. Finally, really to information, just having these facts, how much money is lost due to which sector, if necessary to which group, if possible to which individuals. If such informations are available, and think gradually government will start feeling the pressure. So information is very, very critical. Transparency.
Sufyan, thank you, Sufyan. And I think we should keep in mind some of the things that Chiara mentioned. The idea that the Russian Federation, low trust, opaque, were able to use technology to be able to make those advances. So it might be able to address the information question. Yankuba.
Yes, thank you very much, my dear brother. I want to make a short comment about Africa Continental Free Trade Area. This is a very good idea, but I have my reservations about the successfulness of this regime. I have been working under the Revenue Department for the last couple of years, and what I have seen between the two countries, you are now talking about Africa as a whole, to have a free movement of goods and services. And right now, even one country to another, there are big problems because of protections that they are giving to their individual factories. Now you are talking of Africa as a whole. Are we really serious in what we are talking? I am in the Gambia here right now. We have some of our businessmen who has connections in Mali, and normally they have imports, they request of imports to have petroleum product to go from Gambia to Mali. This is a nightmare. The trucks will come, they will not be allowed to come to the Gambia, neither if they load, they find it very difficult for this process to go. If you have a cement, we have been importing cement from Senegal for the longest period of time. Gambia has never, for your information, never got a cement factory. All that we have is factories that are refilling. For the first time, we have a cement factory in this country, and it has not even been officially inaugurated. They started the testing. They want to move the cement to Senegal, where we were getting for the past decades. It's blocked at the border. So I really have my worries. I really have my worries whether this process of free Africa free continental trade will work, because of the protections that we are doing, for our infant industries or our industries in our country. That's my comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Yankuba. That's sobering. We know that Nigeria kept the border with Benin closed for over a year. Rwanda and Uganda have had issues. Even across the East African community, there's been issues with border closures. So there are definitely things in terms of our ability to be able to deliver on this. So thanks for your comment. Is there anyone else who wanted to address any of the questions? Dauda.
Well, thank you, Gude. I think actually what Yankuba has been saying, and also Sufyan, is actually reinforce the fact that it's really helpful to have the CFTA actually implemented. But what is needed also at the same time is, I guess, making progress towards political integration at the same time. What I mean is, if you have regional institutions that are supposed to implement these agreements, and they are not necessarily actually empowered, chances are, I guess, implementation will be a little bit deficient in some way. So I think, at the same time you're making progress toward economic integration, you also need to see how you can also facilitate actually progress toward fiscal integration, but also political integration. I think that will certainly facilitate, I guess, the implementation. And when I talk about fiscal political integration, I'm talking about the idea of making sure that you empower the regional institutions that are in charge of implementing this agreement, so that they can be actually doing their job effectively.
Thank you. There's a question here that given that most African countries, they do not want external governments to be involved in their internal policies, to what extent, can donor countries or multilateral institutions assist in a way that is respectful and appropriate, especially for the challenging parts of domestic resource mobilization? Seren, I think you started talking about this, so do you want to respond here?
Thank you, Jude. I would say in the World Bank, even our projects that are executed by the bank, they're always intention to be very much aligned with the plans and priorities of the government and the development partners in the country, but also from the headquarters that they are working at, try to be as coordinated as possible. With the 4 leading multilateral organizations that are active on tax issues, IMF, OECD, United Nations, and the World Bank, we came together in 2016 to increase collaboration and coordination of our activities on tax issues. I actually shared the website of the platform's activities, so I really invite our listeners to read. Of course, this is work in progress. As you can imagine, both from the bilateral development partners and the multilateral development partners, they all have their ways of working and their own priorities, but we try to be as coordinated as possible. Maybe Helene might also want to say something about this, more from perhaps the regional perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, Ellen, I was going to come to you, because from the bilateral side, now we've heard from the multilateral, how do you engage with your governments, especially on sensitive issues like taxes that they want to be internal?
Yes, thank you. In the ongoing projects we have in Africa, we always go with reforms that were decided by the Ministry of Finance. And for all the capacity building activities and technical assistance that I referred to, they are decided by the ministry and by the tax administration, and we provide funding of these capacity building activities. So they are decided by the Ministry of Finance to see what is the most useful and what is the most needed locally for domestic resource mobilization.
Just to bring Matt in here, Matt. So MTN had this huge problem with Nigeria on taxes, and we've seen that across Africa, the governments have been actually increasing their taxes on digital products. Yankuba talked about the difficulty of being able to tax e-commerce. So can you talk to us about your perspective from the private side in terms of taxes on the digital products, whether in M-Pesa in Kenya or mobile money, or is on mobile products, in terms of the taxes that governments are increasing on you in terms of domestic resource mobilization?
Thanks. I won't speak for my colleagues at MTN, but yes, this is an important issue to us. As I mentioned earlier, the one potential, whilst we want to always pay our fair tax, one important consideration when we're investing in markets is obviously the taxation regime and how it impacts on the potential cost of doing business in country, but also the services that we provide for our customers. So we have taxation on our at our operational level. So with regards to infrastructure. So in some jurisdictions, like a cost of a cell tower, like more than 50% of that tower may actually be taxation. So the cost of deploying that tower in a part of a country is increased. Then you've got taxation on devices. And I think there's some good studies out there which show the potential impact of taxation on devices on the take-up of digital services. So there's, I think in Kenya a few years ago, they actually reduced the duties on devices, which suddenly saw a significant increase in smartphone and device penetration in Kenya. And then obviously at the service level, so if there are excise duties on our telecom services, that potentially increases the cost of the services to the end consumer as well. So those issues are issues that we regularly talk to local tax authorities and finance ministries, but also we increasingly like to participate in these sessions and talk with our colleagues on this discussion. And I think, as I said earlier, the key thing for us is, as you are now going through new plans in terms of how to build back better, please consider the potential tax implications on the digital transformation programs of each country.
Thank you. And I don't want to commit some sort of dereliction here. If we're talking about domestic resource mobilization, it would be almost crazy if we didn't talk about public financial management. So one of the questions here is about how can African governments build trust to support their tax base? I think Dauda mentioned a little bit about that, about people being able to see a direct connection between tax collection and the services and infrastructure they see. So if any of the panelists want to talk about that in terms of, it's not simply increasing the tax that is collected, it's how the money that is collected is used and used in such a way that it supports people so that it helps to build the trust in the economy. So any of the panelists, please feel free to speak to the question. Sufyan.
Well, basically, this is really the other side of the same coin. We're talking about raising resources. For what purposes? For what purposes? That is the critical question we should ask. That relates to the quality of the government services. Government services depend on how it allocates its budget, the expenditure, the quality of the budget, the priorities, where it allocates. Is it to the basic service, to the education, it is to the health, is it to the infrastructure? Is it where? Is it basically to subsidize the well-to-do people or what? So the first question is really the quality of the budget, how it is allocated. And the second is how it is spent. Is it efficiently, effectively spent? Ultimately, it is the result. Can the government show the results of it is resource collected? So this is very critical, and they are much related. And this will help really for social cohesion, and also this will also give incentives to the taxpayers to be compliant once they see the result. So you mentioned a very critical aspect, which in my view, it's really the other side of the same coins.
Thank you. Ed, I just wanted to say that, on some of these questions, you've worked in this space for a while, even though you're a facilitator on some of these questions. If you have an opinion, please step in. Does anyone else want to talk about the issue of trust building? Yankuba.
Yeah, thank you very much once again. You asked the first questions, it's related to the how can the donors help to mitigate some of the issues that we have with domestic revenue mobilization. I think our developing partners, they are doing their utmost, and it's just that we can never get enough of what they are doing. But one way they can help us to build the capacities of the people that are working in the tax authorities. If you build their capacity so that they can live up to a point where they can audit these big multinational companies, I think that would have a very big advantage for us. That's one. And IMF is very good in that. IMF normally they send people to train tax authorities in terms of capacity building, either tax audit or other areas. But the other area also, which is of more important, that's where we need the World Bank more. That is to help us to change the infrastructures, the IT systems. Unless we have a very good IT systems within the tax authorities, it can never get what the amount that we need to get, because the world has changed. What happened 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and what is happening now is different. Unless we move with the technology so that people are collecting taxes through mobile phones, we have to get the systems that are very active and vibe with the age of where we live in, so that if the development partners can help us to bring us to that level, we should be able to get a lot within the revenue that we have. And now you coming back, maybe I'll stop there, coming back to the second question, which is the taxes that are collected, whether people are seeing that. Well, we as tax collectors, I consider myself being part of those collected tax. We always want to leave that question aside, because we said our role is to mobilize the money. Now, how that money is spent is the role of another institution. But sometimes this is the reality. People pay the tax, they want to see where the tax money is going. This tax money, if they see that there are a lot of development infrastructures going on, by government building the bridges, government building the roads, they are building schools, and they are making sure that the civil servants are taken great care of, well, that is all. It's easy to see. Everybody can see it, and then the compliance level will increase, because everybody will know that the authority that is in charge of collecting the taxes, the money that they are collecting, this is where the government, and it makes the work easy for us, because we collect the money from people, and people are seeing that the countries are being developed. For example, the Gambia, right now, the city of Banjul is all being concrete. The entire city, the project has been given, they are trying to concrete all the streets, trying to do the drainage system. For us, this is a pride by looking at that, because we see that this is what we are doing. The government now is putting it, everybody's seeing it. So we can always say to people, hey, you have to pay your taxes because you can see what is happening. So I'm just giving that as an example. But if the governments are putting the money into those areas, then it makes life easy for us. And then we will not have the resistance, and the compliance level will go up. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think I was muted. Thank you. Ed, please.
If I may just come in briefly, I think, I mean, two things I just wanted to comment on. One is, is it Yakuba's concern about the impediments to trade between Senegal and Gambia, and you also mentioned the closure in Nigeria and Benin and all that sort of thing. I think one of the key things here is that if you look at the AFCFTA, it is really going to address this fundamental concern, because everybody now would have a common tariff system. You all, will be able to trade on equal footing across borders, across national boundaries. And the point that Dawda raised about ceding some sovereign responsibility to a supranational body is very important, because trade, in principle, is a club good. It's, in other words, it is excludable, but it's non-rival in the sense that you could be excluded from it. So there is an element in here that we need to consider the fact that under the CFTA, even in terms of things that are made to support particularly the weaker ones or the ones that are going to lose more, to compensate through financing in a sort of a declining order of support to the budget, to ensure that the revenue losses are going to be cushioned somehow. So the anxiety about, moving zero tariff and so on are going to be allayed. And the sort of the challenges that Yakuba was raising are certainly going to be addressed through that process. I think it's a question of getting good information. The AFCFTA Secretariat in Accra has been launching a number of webinars to educate the population all over on how this whole process is going to be. And I think you should, I don't know the website, but I think you can get the website very easily to be able to access some of the webinars that are going on and be educated on it. So I'll stop you.
Thank you, Ed, for that. So one of the, Helene spoke about this when she talked. One of the things that I've mentioned was that, especially for collecting real estate taxes, that satellite images can actually help. I just wanted, if any of the panelists could just talk a little bit about, technologies. Helene began this conversation, but if anyone wanted to add to it, technologies that can actually help to close the gap in terms of being able to collect taxes and be able to collect taxes more accurately. So what kinds of technologies that we can?
Well, thank you, Judy. I mean, I'm just going to jump in on this and also take this opportunity also to respond to your previous question about actually how to make sure that the taxes that are collected are spent efficiently. I think, we have talked a lot about the challenges facing African countries in implementing tax reforms. But we also actually have to remember that this crisis, this pandemic crisis, provides an opportunity for African governments also to build taxpayers' trust in tax systems. You talk to taxpayers, you talk to investors about actually what's their view of tax systems in Africa. Many of them would tell you, in many cases, they are complex, or maybe they need to be more transparent. So I believe this is an opportunity, as all governments around the continent are faced with the need to respond to the crisis, to build health infrastructure, to support businesses and households. This is an opportunity for countries to also take that opportunity to strengthen fiscal transparency, so that taxpayers can see what is going to be done with the tax proceeds and how actually they allocate it to support recovery, but also most importantly how they use to manage the pandemic. I think that's critical. I think the human and economic toll of the pandemic is certainly very severe. And if the government make the case that they are using efficiently the tax revenues to respond and contain that toll, I think that would actually be very much understood. And that's where actually also the need to digitalize tax system actually comes to play. Because by doing so, you're also actually shedding more transparency and more lights in actually how, of course, the revenue agencies are operating, but also how public expenditure agencies also are actually performing. And that's certainly something that is an opportunity that needs to be seized. And one last issue that I also wanted to say, I think Ellen touched upon it in her presentation. If you have well-designed tax system, they can help you not only help create jobs, but they can also help you overcome or address actually inequality. And everyone knows that inequality is very high in Africa, and we need to make sure that actually we use fiscal policy efficiently to address it. And this pandemic, unfortunately, is aggravating, is actually even making inequality even worse than it has been. So it's an opportunity also for government to come up with sensitive fiscal policies and make stride and make actually progress toward more progressivity in some ways, but using actually more well-designed and targeted fiscal tax system to help actually those that are on the wrong side of income distribution. Thank you.
Dauda, thank you very much. We have less than 10 minutes left. Actually, we have like 6 minutes left. So if each of the panelists wanted to take 30 seconds for parting thoughts, we would appreciate that. And if you wanted to pass to, that's fine. So we will start with Sufyan and then just go around in terms of concluding remarks.
I think we agree that how important it is for African governments to be serious when it comes to financing its own needs. we also agree that technically there are solutions. Technologically, there are available solutions, and there are institutions, independent institutions that can help us. The World Bank, the IMF, and also the others. The critical one is a political commitment, and the political commitment should also only come from African people and African government that we can do through transparency and by showing the results of the government services.
Thank you, Sufyan. Saren?
First of all, thank you for this, for inviting us to be part of this very asking a great question. A bit of a technical response, but it's valuable that we do bring equity analysis to tax policy reforms in advance. These reforms will benefit the poor and will help
It looks like Washington, D.C. needs investment in IT. So sorry about that, Sarah. We will move on to Kara now.
I'd like to emphasize Sufyan's point. I think it is important it's a great opportunity for Africa to get together and to think what are the best solutions. Technically, there are plenty of opportunities. And maybe you organize another event, we can just talk about technical solutions that are fascinating. But I think it's very important that the framework, I would like to emphasize the framework. It's right now we're thinking about equity, a priority, as Dauda said. Technology and innovation are the enablers. And the last point that was not perhaps too much exploit this time, but hopefully we will have another opportunity, is sustainability. And how actually every politician is now called to think about climate change and adaptation mitigation, and taxation has a role to play. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Matt?
Just to say thank you very much for the opportunity to participate, and looking forward to continuing discussions with the objective for us to support digital transformation in the markets. And as I said, tax policy has an important role to play in that. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Matthew. Ellen?
Yes, thank you all to all of you for this stimulating debate. And yes, I wanted to just add that there are some promising opportunities. Technology is one of them, and maybe we just didn't say so much about the risk and the cybersecurity and the personal data protection that is put our eyes, but that could be for another webinar about these questions. And also the last point I wanted to make is about what we said and what I think is very important about how spending is made, and that spending will help, good spending will help to build tax morale and increase taxes. Thank you.
Thank you. Yankuba? You're muted. You're muted, Yankuba. You're muted.
Sorry, I didn't know. Yeah, sorry. I said thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion. I think it is high time that we as Africans, we all try to look inward, because it's been a long time that we are asking for donor money, donor all the time requesting. And this is obvious. If you keep on asking people all the time, even you and your wife, every time your wife is keep on telling you, give me, at one point you don't want to give anymore. So there is a donor fatigue going on. So we need to look inwards and make sure that we look at the domestic revenue. How do we try to maximize the domain so that we can be self-reliant. And to get that, one of the speakers just said, political will. We need to have the political support. And once we get the political support, we will get the needed revenue. Capacity building of the staffs. The staffs must be trained so that they can stand the multinational companies in terms of auditing, in terms of looking at their documents. Unless we have that capacity, it will be a problem. And then thirdly, I just have 2 points to say. Invest in the computerization, that's the technology. We must make sure that we invest in the technology within the systems that we have. That will help us greatly to make sure that we match the time, because otherwise we have a problem. And finally, we have to look at the way we give out incentives. If you sit down, we don't look at the way our tax expenditures goes, we will not go anywhere, because the big companies will come and you give them 5-year break. When that is over, they apply it again, you give them again. So you are just standing at one place, going nowhere. So these are some of the points I think all of us can take, and then it will be beneficial for our domestic tax revenue mobilization. Thank you.
We just want to call on Mark Plant to just say thanks to our guests, our panelists, and to close. Mark.
Thank you, Jude. And let me thank all of our guests, our participants. It was a very interesting seminar. Indeed, it emphasizes the principle that Africa needs to take hold of its future, and domestic revenue mobilization is going to be one way of doing that. Let me also thank the people who joined us. We had a couple hundred viewers. Our technical people tell us we're very appreciative for their attendance, and a big round of thanks to ACET, to Ed Brown, and others for their cooperation in this seminar. And we hope this is the first of a series of seminars where CGD and ACET will work together to look at Africa's future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks. Thank you all.
Yeah.